Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is a global audience that we're reaching out to. So hello to you from the Asian Development Bank. My name is Anuj Mehta, and welcome to the Southeast Asia Development Symposium. This is our session on financing post-pandemic green growth and green recovery. I think such an important and a topical subject that I think we've got a huge number of people who signed on to see this. This is a joint session that we're doing together with the European Commission, the EU Switch Asia program, and the OECD's Southeast Asia Regional Program. So I'm delighted to do this jointly with the European Commission and the OECD. And we have a wonderful number of speakers and panel members for the session as we go forward. I'm going to very quickly say a big welcome to Jean-Louis Ville, who's the head of unit for East Asia and the Pacific at the Directorate-General at the International Partnerships European Commission, and to Virginie Marchal, the Senior Program Manager, Sustainable Infrastructure Environment Directorate at the OECD, as well as to a wonderful panel members, Efiro Amatong, Commissioner in the Securities and Exchange Commission of the Philippines, Tiza Mafira, Associate Director at Climate Policy Initiative, Sean Kidney, CEO at the Climate Bonds Initiative, CBI, and Virginie Marchal again, who will join also at the panel. And I also have my co-moderator, Naida, who's on screen, who will help us during the open discussion and the Q&A session. So big welcome to everyone, and especially to the audience who's listening in from different parts of the world. We ourselves are in all different parts of the world. So we are going to use the Philippine time that is on the agenda that we'd laid out. In terms of the run of the program, I'm going to give a very quick overview, set the context a little bit from my perspective at the ADB. And then I will request the opening speakers, Jean-Louis as well as Virginie, to come in. But as at the beginning, let me quickly lay out the context. You know, I run something called the Innovation Hub in the Asian Development Bank, and we've been focusing on green and innovative finance for Asia for the last certainly 2 years, and this has suddenly become all that more important in the post-COVID pandemic context. This session is really trying to understand not just about green investments, but about scaling up green finance, because the issue is the volume of support needed for countries to embark on green finance and green recovery post-pandemic. Even before the pandemic hit, two things stood out for my region, Southeast Asia. The volume of funding needed for the area and the impact because of the vulnerability of Southeast Asia. 600 million people in Southeast Asia, some of the longest coastlines in Asia, a huge impact from climate change and environmental degradation in many of our cities, very visible in the seas and the smoke pollution that you're seeing. And so it was already a major issue. But the flip side to that was the financing needed. The financing, something like about 210 billion per year needed in Southeast Asia, and 50 to 60% of that needed to come from the private sector, bonds or equity investments, etc., which is not happening at the scale needed. So the issue is, how do you catalyze that kind of green finance? And now in the post-pandemic period where the economies have contracted, just for the Southeast Asia region, we estimate a negative contraction of 4.4% this year in 2020, which obviously has an impact in terms of how much the public sector can spend. So the financing gap is a little bigger. Now, there is a way, and that is green finance. Naturally, I would say that. We've been working with a facility that we manage, owned by all the countries of Southeast Asia, called the ASEAN Catalytic Green Facility, ACGF, which is trying to deliver this impact of what we call a leveraged finance approach. So some funding which is used from the public sector to catalyze and leverage in money from the private sector. And that's the ACGF approach. Now, how do we use that approach? How do we scale up? Those are the issues at hand. So what we are trying to do in this session as we go forward is try to focus on 4 central challenges, which we will lay out now and then ask the speakers and the panel members to respond to. And the 4 challenges are these. Number one, is there a need and how do we put in place green recovery policies and regional green frameworks by governments to really drive the green finance investments? Number two, is there a need for at the national level, green recovery funds? A visible perception of green being the focus of policy. So number two is national green recovery funds for de-risking. How do we put them in place? Is there a need? Number three, does the ASEAN region need to take some steps to improve their access to those global green capital markets, which we've seen so much of in Europe, certainly? How do we do that in the ASEAN region? All right, I hope you can still hear me. Now, this is my alternative computer. So we will ask Jean-Louis Ville, Head of Unit for East Asia and the Pacific at Director-General at the International Partnerships European Commission, to give his opening remarks. Jean-Louis previously occupied the position of Acting Director for Human Development and Migration in DG DevCo, as well as the Head of Unit in charge of Human Rights, Gender and Democratic Governance, and is also currently the Acting Director for Middle East, Asia and Pacific at the European Commission in the Director-General for International Partnerships. Jean-Louis, I will hand over to you for your opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anush. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Anush, a personal note, I mean, I admire your capacity to jump on your alternative computer. I'm not sure I would be able to do that. So congratulations for that one. Dear Virginie, dear panelists and participants, it's really a great pleasure, and I'm delighted to attend the opening session of this ADB SEADS, focusing on financing post-pandemic green growth and green recovery. The coronavirus pandemic has shaken the world in its core, testing healthcare, welfare systems, societies at large and economies, and our way of living and working together. Governments across the world have deployed a significant amount of emergency capital in response to the coronavirus. So did also countries in Asia, obviously. However, a year after the start of the crisis, governments also recognized the need to prepare for long-term recovery and stimulus packages to support economic growth and employment security. It is evident that the design of a recovery intervention is crucial, as decisions made now will create systems, institutions, and assets, and define development directions that will last into the future. There is a critical window of opportunity, as we see it now, to reset how we orient our economy and how we build back or perhaps forward better. Climate change and environment consideration must be front and center of the COVID-19 response. And the second element is that recovery strategies must find viable ways to attract capital from various non-public sources to leverage its effect. In Southeast Asia, we saw already how several countries, such as Indonesia and the Philippines, have created task forces to explore strategic options for their economic recovery. And I believe this is exactly the way forward. Now, let me explain in a few words what the EU response was. The EU took several steps to support its member states and to engage in green recovery activities with its partners around the world. Let me provide with a couple of examples. In July 2020, our leaders agreed on a massive recovery plan of 750 billion to mitigate the impact of the pandemic and invest in green and digital transition. The so-called Next Generation EU has absolutely no precedence. About 50% of it will be distributed over the next 7 years through grants, while the remaining will be dispersed through loans. This has called for greater efforts from our member states to prepare national recovery packages for specific sectors, including green, climate, and sustainability focus. Second element, under the umbrella of the European Green Deal, a just transition mechanism was also created, aiming at mobilizing at least 100 billion euro until 2027 to bring productive investments in small and medium-sized enterprises, creating new startups, promote research and innovation, and protect the environment. Third element, or third examples, the EU is also supporting the transformation of the financial system to manage climate risks and mobilize capital for green investments. This is pursued also in the broader context of sustainable development. We are, for instance, working to integrate sustainable finance considerations in all financial flows through domestic revenue mobilization, public finance management, and green procurement. The EU is also working to promote enabling frameworks and transparency in financial and economic activities, also in cooperation with our international partners. Such tools include, for instance, the EU Taxonomy, which establishes a classification system to filter investments towards activities contributing to 6 defined environmental objectives, such as climate change mitigation, circular economy, with a do not harm principle. While this only will be binding for our member states, the EU also launched an international platform for sustainable finance forum where sectoral taxonomies could be discussed to ensure a fair development of such green frameworks and standards at global level. Ultimately, these frameworks will enable investors to reorient investments towards more sustainable technologies and businesses. Investments will be a key aspect for the recovery and to relaunch economies. One excellent example in your region is the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility that Anuj mentioned in his introductory words, and which is supporting climate change and environmental sustainability goals. Managed by our excellent friends of ADB, the EU will also contribute with 50 million euro to this tool. And finally, we need our international partnership to build on green, digital, resilient, and socially just recovery. To realize this objective, the EU has called for a global recovery initiative to build back better. Now, a few words perhaps to insist and to illustrate the relations with our international partners. For the EU, the Global Recovery Initiative is an important element in its cooperation around the world. It is about ensuring that financial resources can indeed help countries in their recovery while leaving no one behind. Our new European Fund for Sustainable Development, as known as EFSD+, will be extended to Asia and provide partner countries with concessional loans to finance their public investments and priorities. It will also allow crowding in and stimulating private investments. The EU is also looking into green bonds, which may become another key element of our support to partner countries. Here, we can already see a lot of potential with your region, where the issuance of green bonds and green loans almost doubled in 2019, thus reflecting the strong appetite for this instrument. As you can see, there is already a lot being done from the EU, but more still can be built together with our partners around the world as the pandemic and its recovery concern all of us. Let me conclude by thanking the ADB SEADS for giving us the opportunity to being part of this second symposium. I'd like also to thank the team of our EU Switch Asia program for closely working with them over the last weeks to gather together excellent speakers, but especially ideas to support the recovery of your region. Over the last 12 months, our program has been supporting countries in the Southeast Asia in developing their national action plans on sustainable consumption and production. We are looking closely with governments in Cambodia, Vietnam, Lao PDR, but also in Central Asia and South Asia. These plans are helping governments to consider new production and consumption models which are greener and more sustainable, thus providing the first step into their recovery. I think this is time for me now to pass the floor to Virginie and to our excellent panelists and then listen to their proposal for green recovery in the region. Thank you very much again. And Virginie, I think it's over to you.
Right. So I think we are live again now. So thanks again to Jean-Louis, who has now left the floor. And welcome to Virginie. Great to have you here, Virginie. The OECD is another great partner for the ADB, in fact, for the ASEAN Catalytic Green Facility, with whom we've been having so many discussions over the last year and a half. Virginie has been leading Southeast Asia Sustainable Infrastructure Program as Senior Program Manager at the OECD. With especially interesting work, I think, in 2018 on a joint World Bank, UN Environment, OECD financing program. I think it was the Climate Futures Rethinking Infrastructure, which I think is so sorely needed again now, post-pandemic, with finance being such a critical issue. So, with that, let me pass it over to you, Virginie, to make your comments, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anush, and thank you very much to the ADB for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be part of this session today. I wanted to thank Jean-Louis for the EU leadership in trying to green recovery packages, but I'm sure it will be passed to him. I'm just going to step back a little bit from the pure financing angle of the transition to put that in the context of what is needed in the global policy landscape to make sure we can scale up and shift the investment needed in the right type of infrastructure. But before doing that, there's been some preliminary release of data on how to analyze the big recovery packages that have been around, and I'll share that as well with you today. So first of all, I have exactly the same framing than you did, Anush, so I'll do that very quickly with the same data. We face a triple crisis in Asia and in the world, actually. The first one is the infrastructure gap. The second one is the economic crisis. And we see that there's been a contraction of GDP in Southeast Asia, more limited than in other parts of the world, but still significant. But I think what is very important to highlight here is that this crisis has struck the poorest the most. So one of the big challenges was before the crisis inequalities, and now the big challenge is even increased inequalities. So how can we make sure we take on board in the recovery the poor people, the informal economies, and the SMEs is one of the key challenges of the recovery plan. The third emergency and the third crisis is the climate crisis. All countries have kind of recognized that there's a need to reduce emission to net zero by the second half of the century. And this means a radical shift in the way we are building infrastructure. There's more than 60% of emissions that are embedded in our infrastructure, and we really need to reduce this. Having said that, having painted this gloomy picture, there's a unique momentum today for change. Why is it unique? Well, first, what we see globally is that countries haven't given up on climate. The major economies have committed to this net zero pathways, and this is very encouraging, particularly in Asia, actually. Then we see some progress on shrinking finance for coal-related investment from countries in the Philippines, for instance, but also from major international organizations and banks that are limiting their finance for such polluting options. Third, last but not least, actually, is this massive rescue and post-COVID recovery packages. I'm quoting a number here that had just been released last week from UNDP and Oxford Smith School. It's $14.6 trillion US dollars that are spent on recovery measures. I mean, there are too many zeros actually to really realize how much it represents, but it's a huge amount of money, and taking this money and as an opportunity to build back better, as we said, is absolutely essential. The good news as well is what we need for climate are sustainable infrastructure. And the good news is that those infrastructure are good for the recovery, they're good for growth. Many of those investments are creating jobs and are creating the short-term economic boost that we need in the economies. So why it's not happening is actually the question of the day today. When we're looking at the plans that countries have put forward in the green recovery, what do we see? So this is preliminary data, not for citation, but it's an analysis from the OECD that is covering 43 countries. We see that measures with a positive impact are representing $350 billion today. On the other end, measures with a mixed or negative impact, such as bailout for fossil fuel companies or investing more in biofuels that could be good for climate, but bad for other biodiversity issues, represent more or less the same amount. This is not counting actually the big EU push for green, because we couldn't identify how much double counting there was with national actions. But this is the picture. So it looks good in a sense. But what's important is to put this picture in the perspective of the global stimulus, how much money is spent. And what we see is that those environmentally relevant measures that we can really trace are a very small portion of the total measures through the stimulus. It's an order of magnitude different, larger, the overall stimulus. So really, the challenge is people have been, the countries have been investing a lot in recovery measures, but most of them are actually mirroring the existing economy. So that it's kind of encouraging the status quo. They are protecting existing businesses, existing industries, existing investment, which means that if we go on like that, we'll miss the opportunity to really shift the investment in the infrastructure we need. So those are different data that are from this global recovery database that is showing exactly the same picture, which is really the green recovery is a very small portion out of the total spending. And this is in addition to current trends in infrastructure that is showing on the right-hand side that are still falling short on the long-term low-emission development pathways. Countries globally are still over-investing in fossil fuel supply and under-investing in the technology we need, such as energy efficiency and renewable power. So we're not on the right track. This is a global picture. Of course, the picture is very different depending on the countries and on the regions. One of the key messages from this slide is that, well, there are some front leaders, but what we see is that a majority of developing and emerging economies are not doing as much in terms of green recovery responses than other economies. There are good reasons for that. I mean, stretched fiscal space but what we need to do collectively is really how we can help those countries really invest and orient those stimulus funds in the right types of infrastructure. So I'm going to turn to the kind of emerging answers of really what we can do. There are two different levels of answers. The first thing is, what can we do out of those stimulus? How we can use those stimulus? So the first thing is really to encourage countries to do ex-ante evaluation of their measures. I mean, it hasn't been done enough in the first financial crisis in 2008, and today we really encourage countries to do that. The second thing that is a useful tool as well is to introduce green conditionality to the different measures to make sure that they are going and encouraging ourselves to go in a greener society. The third point, which is quite interesting, is that when we go to the sectoral breakdown of those measures, we see that energy and transport have the lion's share of the green stimulus, which is good because we know we need them for decarbonization. But there's an opportunity as well to invest more in other sectors, such as, particularly in Southeast Asia, greening energy-intensive industries, which is a big chunk of emissions, and that we need to do a lot of efforts to decarbonize them. And it leads to the last point as well regarding those packages is the importance of innovation. And Anush, you mentioned that at the beginning in your introductory remarks, but without innovation, we will not drive the transition that is needed. So this is the fourth recommendation. But beyond those recovery packages, actually, we're all aware that there are some structural misalignments in our overall policy framework that needs as well to be addressed. This is a visual actually from a report from 2018. And so yes, it was 3 years ago, but the messages are still very much valid today. The COVID hasn't changed the fundamentals of our economies. So what is transformative for governments? What can they do to really scale up and shift those investments? The first thing is about planning. I mean, without good long-term plans, without good projects that are aligned with those plans, the private sector will never invest. and the right type of support. So there's a huge effort to do from planning agencies, but also a cross-ministerial approach to make sure that the long-term plans are consistent with the shift that is needed. The second aspect is on innovation. We're falling short on all sectors regarding innovation technologies, and more investment in this is needed. The third one is budget. And it's even more important in a period of tight fiscal space for governments. Each money invested needs to leverage private sector investment as much as it can. And when we look at current budgets, and for instance as well, public procurement practices, they should really mainstream this climate constraint at the outset of the different projects they are commissioning. It's more than 7% of GDP globally, these public procurement practices, and they can be a huge leverage for the transition. The fourth one is about the financial system, and it's going to be part of the discussion after that, but really the financial system and financial institutions have a huge role to play to change the way they practice finance, they evaluate projects to include several other dimensions. And last but not least, cities. I mean, at the OECD, we look a lot at national governments, but subnational governments are really the area where the decisions on infrastructure are made, and we need to empower those cities and those governments through transfer, through access to international markets and green bonds, for instance, which is not always the case in some countries. Those are a critical element of the transition. The good news is that we have, organizations like the OECD have a wealth of tools and instruments and practices and standards to help countries do that and deliver on those ideas. I'm just flagging one report that has been put together for the G20 last year, which is about really a compendium of good practices of really how to invest in quality infrastructure investment. Having said that, well, we often produce a lot of handouts and good books, but what we see as well is that there's not necessarily the ownership from the countries on those practices. And this is just my last point. At the OECD, we engaged on a new technical assistance program for countries in Asia, in Central Asia and Southeast Asia, to really help them align their infrastructure plans and practices with the long-term goals. So we're targeting different countries, and we're part of a consortium of partners with IISD, the International Transport Forum, UNDP, WWF. And really the idea is to help countries take this holistic approach through building capacity in governments to help scale up the transition. So there are three different transformative areas that will be supported through this program. The first time is on the planning, and particularly looking at the missing link between those long-term plans and the short-term decisions. Governments are missing a lot of tools to do that, and we're trying to address them. The second one is this enabling policy framework, and here we're joining forces with the Clean Energy and Finance Mobilization Program that has already been quite active in Indonesia and is starting in Vietnam on really how to unlock the barriers in the current policy frameworks. And last but not least, the importance of mobilizing the financial communities and businesses. So I'm going to stop here, and thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Virginie. That was room for pause and room for thinking. I think your initial comments on what's not happening, not being on the right track, and a missed opportunity if we don't act now is such an important message, I think, to pass to policymakers and decision makers. Because the other part of it is what you said. COVID has not changed the fundamentals of our economies. So what was true earlier, maybe a little bit more extreme now in terms of revenue models, etc. The fact is you still need to prepare bankable, global standard green projects to attract the private investment. And I think your points, your 4 recommendations, especially leverage we hear a lot about 1 by 6, $1 of public sector to catalyze $5 or $6 from the private sector, is so important that's needed to really attract those global pools of fund that's needed. I think your last point, which was the cities and capacities, I think so fundamentally important to go from national to subnationals, and what can we do there to make projects and funds happen. So fabulous. Thank you so much for your remarks, and look forward to the discussion further with you, because you will be now joining the panel, which sort of allows me nicely to sort of to introduce the panel members that will be coming on screen now. So we have we're now going to move into a discussion with our panel members, and if I can introduce, you already know Virginie. Virginie is on the panel, but let me introduce F. Amatong, who is the Commissioner in the Securities and Exchange Commission of the Philippines. He was appointed a commissioner there in 2014 and is currently the supervising commissioner for the Markets and Securities Regulation Department and Economic Research and Training. But F also combines a lot of knowledge from the Ministry of Finance, or the Department of Finance in the Philippines, where he was previously Assistant Secretary, and really understands PPPs. He's been involved in privatizations, public-private partnerships for a long time, and has been a great friend of this whole push on green capital markets. So welcome to the panel, F. I will also quickly introduce Sean. Sean has been working, Sean Kidney, very well recognized CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative, a central figure, I think, globally to push green bonds and associated bonds. Has been working on green bond definitions, certification, most recently on projects in Thailand, one of the first sustainability bonds that have happened in the region post the pandemic. 34 trillion of assets represented on its board. I mean, that's astounding, Sean. And I know how passionate Sean is about growing the green bond market all over the world, including in the ASEAN. He's a member of the European Commission's platform on sustainable finance, and therefore also has been driving a number of the green initiatives that are emerging in the EU. Welcome, Sean. Tiza, wonderful to have you here. Tiza is Associate Director at the Climate Policy Initiative, based out of Indonesia. I think she must be in Jakarta right now, leading a team of analysts to deliver studies on climate finance effectiveness, has a legal background, which is so important from a policy framing perspective. And also, of course, is a member of this Indonesia plastic bag diet movement. She's the executive director of that. Again, a fundamental important for the region, plastics and oceans health. And Virginie, who I introduced earlier. So we've got our 4 panel members. Welcome to all of you. I'm not giving any of you a chance to say hello or thank you at the moment, but welcome to the panel. What we're going to do now for the panel is basically have a series of questions, which I'll try and direct to each of the panel members to speak about for about 5 minutes or 5 or 6 minutes each. And let me start with F. And I think the first question there is, we've spoken a lot about green capital markets, but what do we need to do in ASEAN to scale up these issuances of green bonds? How do we do that and do it fast? Over to you, F. Your perspectives on that, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anuj, for that question on scaling up. So just graphically to let me share some slides with you on what ASEAN, the regulators in ASEAN have been doing, particularly my fellow capital market regulators at the ASEAN Capital Market Forum. Actually, even before the pandemic hit, ASEAN has been seriously pursuing a goal of sustainable capital markets. And I think that should be easy to understand because all 10 ASEAN countries are severely affected by climate change. So this is not something that is a theoretical challenge to any of us. This is all very real. The need for climate adapted, climate appropriate infrastructure aligned with the goals of the Paris Accord is a very real thing for all of us. And because of this, we've taken this goal of sustainable capital markets very seriously. I think you mentioned that green bonds, and I think Jean-Louis also mentioned the green bond market. ASEAN, as part of its roadmap, I'm showing you here, part of our roadmap for sustainable capital markets have adopted green, social, and sustainable standards based on the ICMA Green, Social, and Sustainable Principles. And although we only started in 27, as of end 2020, we have something like $8.5 billion worth of green, social, and sustainability bonds issued throughout the ASEAN region. And this does not yet include the 2 billion green sukuk issued by Indonesia that is aligned also with these principles. So this is something that we've been taking seriously for some time. But what we've come to realize recently is that in order to really to have this goal of scaling up, we need to have a common understanding of what we mean by green, social, or sustainable, and indeed transition. I think Virginie mentioned a while ago the need to expand green finance beyond the traditional transportation or renewable energy and into certain sectors that are really the emitting sectors, and trying to find a way for them to transition. And in order to do this, the consensus that we've reached within ASEAN, not something that's always easy to do across 10 countries with varying stages of development, but the consensus that we've reached really is that we need to have a common language, a common understanding, common concepts behind what we mean by green, social, sustainable, and indeed transition, so that we know how to direct our efforts and we are all moving in the same direction towards our common goals. And in this connection, one of the things that is being discussed intensively among ASEAN regulators. So I have here on the right-hand portion of this slide 4 regulatory groups within ASEAN. My own group, the ASEAN Capital Market Forum, the Working Committee on Capital Market Development, the Senior Level Committee on ASEAN Financial Integration, and the ASEAN Insurance Regulators Meeting, 4 very different groups, but have managed within the past few months to really come together in response to this directive coming from the ASEAN Finance Ministers and Governors Meeting to have a common sustainable agenda for ASEAN. And that agenda right now is really trying to develop an ASEAN taxonomy. And for people who are familiar with this process, our friends in the EU, and indeed our friend Sean Kidney, who's been really at the forefront of trying to develop this kind of common classification and terminology at Climate Bonds Initiative. This is a very difficult and complex undertaking. But within the first 2 months, actually, of 2021, those 4 regulatory groups have more or less come together and outlined these 5 basic principles, if you will, behind the idea of coming up with an ASEAN taxonomy. And again, these are our draft principles, if you will, behind what we're trying to do with ASEAN taxonomy development. And the first one is again, as I said, trying to come up with a common understanding, a common language of what is green, social, sustainable, and transitional that would guide all 10 ASEAN countries in their activities and indeed in their public investment and in their efforts to spur private sector investment. The goal under Principle 2 is to take into consideration existing and widely used taxonomies where appropriate. So we are aware of the developments in the EU, and in fact, we are aware of criteria being formed by private bodies like CBI, like ICMA. We are also aware of regulatory initiatives in IOSCO and in other countries that have produce effectively guidelines of understanding what is green, social, and sustainable. And where appropriate to the ASEAN region, we hope to incorporate what has already been learned in these other jurisdictions. Principle 3 is to make sure that the taxonomy is applicable to ASEAN and beneficial to its members. We live in a particular geography of the world, and our needs may be slightly different from that of other countries. I got a question on this actually when we were sitting as part of the advisory panel to the ICMA green bonds principles. And we pointed out, for example, that energy efficiency, when you're coming from a cold temperate region where you need to warm in the winter, the targets or the goals or the criteria for energy efficiency may be very different from where we are, where it's very tropical. We don't have a warming, we don't have winter, so we don't have a need to burn energy for warmth, but we do have an increasing need to cool, particularly because of global warming. The fourth principle that we've arrived at really is that as much as possible, any framework or definitions that we come up with should be, where appropriate, science-based. And we say where appropriate because, as I said, the goal here is to develop not only a green and sustainable and transitional taxonomy, but also a social taxonomy. And what we've learned from our own experience is that, except in cases of COVID-19, where the social need really is international, many times a determination of what is socially beneficial or important is very much dependent on the specific country or jurisdiction that you're considering. And then lastly, the goal again is to respond to the call by the finance ministers and governors for all sectors of the ASEAN financial markets to align. So the banking, insurance, and capital market sector, as much as possible, this taxonomy will provide alignment of policy alignment across all financial sectors and products, or at the very least, not conflict with each other. And these are essentially like our 5 goals in trying to come up with this taxonomy. This is something that's being presented, that will be presented at the ASEAN Finance Ministers and Governors meeting towards the end of this month. And I won't go through the whole process that we've adopted, the use of a taxonomy board that's really being acting as a kind of consultant group, a consultation group for the development of the taxonomy. But I do want to highlight that in coming up with what we think is a realistic approach to ASEAN coming up with this taxonomy, well, it is a multi-layered and iterative approach, meaning that we don't expect to come up with a very complex set of definitions right away, but hopefully with support from partners and especially from the scientific community, we can come up with a set of layered set of principles, metrics, and then eventually thresholds that will more or less define different aspects of what is green, social, sustainable, and transitional. And it is our goal for this process to be iterative. It's not a one-shot. It's not a one-shot goal, but hopefully something that we can improve as more information comes along, as the science gets stronger, and as Virginie also mentioned, as innovation comes up, and things that were not originally thought of as possible become more and more possible. So this is the approach we're taking in ASEAN, and we think, despite the complexity and challenges involved, this is probably the best way to really scale up and spur Build Back Better program. And let me end just there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, F. That was brilliant. I think, I mean, such an important point about definitions and common approaches across, even within the multilateral world, even within our own sector colleagues, what is green? The definition has never been so well understood. And, I think at the ACGF, we ourselves try to define it as climate plus environment with a clear taxonomy, which we develop, as you know, partly actually with you when we were discussing this with the EIB. But your approach on taxonomy for ASEAN is wonderful, because it's local and global both, because you're trying to develop something for the region, and yet you're looking at what's happening globally and seeing how it sort of meshes in here. So sounds a wonderful roadmap that you've got there, and good luck with that. Certainly necessary for scaling up the capital markets. With that, let me move on to Sean at CBI and bring you in, Sean, in terms of the role that green bonds or sustainable bonds or similar, could they play a role in supporting a green recovery? Because, we've had this discussion before with different governments, where governments have often said, the cost of doing a green bond versus any other type of bond is pretty much the same, the prices at which I can get it. So is there merit in doing it? Will it receive will it raise the kind of money that we need to really influence, sort of the green investments that are needed, especially post-pandemic? And, so what do governments need to do to really get interested in this, to make it happen? And what are the gaps? Should we do green bonds, not at national level, but at sub-national level, as Virginie was saying earlier? So over to you, Sean, for your wise guidance in terms of the role for bonds and green recovery. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Anuj. We've heard a bit about the brutal period we've been through, the need to recover with jobs, but we've also heard this bit about need to look forward, not back. A number of our speakers have mentioned that, building back up and so on, and that is absolutely critical. Any crisis is an opportunity. Of course it is. It's been a really rough crisis, but we need to use this inflection point to decide what kind of world we want our citizens and our children to live in. This is the opportunity for us. And one of those things that is absolutely certain is that we want it to be better, we want it to be cleaner, we want it to be greener, and we want the traffic in Jakarta to be better while we're at it too. This is all green infrastructure, folks. We can do a hell of a lot here, relatively straightforwardly, with using this inflection point and the need for stimulus to stimulate our economies in the right direction. That's what this panel is about. It's very simple in a way. Will the money buy it? Look, we're not going to solve Indonesia's debt burden or the Philippines' debt burden with shaving a little bit off the interest rate of a green bond. Let's be clear about that. That's not the point of this exercise. What we can do is get investors more interested in the long-term story of countries. We can broaden the base of investors. That's very clear. That happens with thematic issuance. We've seen thematic issuance out of Europe in the last few weeks, which is 10 times oversubscribed. Way higher than a vanilla bond. The Italian sovereign, 8.5 billion euros placed. They had more than 85 billion of orders there. We can get stickiness. That is, investors that will like the story and stay off the story. Many investors, KfW, the German Development Bank, talks about the incredible effect of loyalty on investors they thought were already loyal. To their surprise, these investors phone up and say, oh, I love that green bond. Tell me more about it, and so on. I want to know what KfW is doing in this area, etc. That applies across an ASEAN as well. And there is price. If you can deliver in hard currencies, you will very simply get price benefit. I mean, it's quite literally. I mean, the Germans kind of conclusively said this last year when they issued their German Green Bund, and they issued another bond at about the same time. They got a 1 basis benefit on a negative interest rate bond. I mean, negative interest rate. And I want to say there is a bank in the Philippines, F knows the name, who's issued a bond in Swiss francs and got a negative interest rate too for a green bond. I think it was the first time ever in the Philippines, if I remember correctly. So, we have palpable proof that if you are able to, not everyone can, if you are able to issue in hard currencies, you will get price cost. It's not going to be a price benefit to whittle away your sovereign debt pile. Let's be clear about that. But it's worth the other benefits of investor engagement and signalling. And investors are keen on this because they see this pile, this taxonomy, I'm going to say, this large pool of investments that are green and social as indicators that corporations, governments, subnationals are doing something and are moving in the right direction, which makes them less likely to be at risk of being affected by climate change and policy change going forward. Investors are kind of terrified. I remember we've got 110 countries around the world committing to net zero carbon targets by 2050, plus China committing to 2060 carbon neutrality, and the US about to dive into this pool. That's like sea change in 18 months. 18 months ago, I think we had 1 or 2 countries around. Now, that means there's going to be a hell of a lot of policy change and policy impact coming through. We all know that. We've already seen it in energy, where policy change by the Germans, the Chinese drove down the price of solar renewable, and now Malaysia's reaping the benefit of that low-cost renewable. It's going to happen everywhere. And you want to stay ahead of it. This pool, green stuff, is ahead of that. And I'm going to say that applies to resilience as well, because as we build back our economies and prepare for future shocks, unfortunately, we're going to have a lot of future shocks. We're going to have more pandemics, we're going to have more weather shocks. That reduces the risk of default, frankly, if we're dealing with resilience. So it's an indicator to investors that the Philippines is better placed than, say, Pakistan, who has not got as good a resilience policy. And you getting that differentiation, and Moody's has been reflected on credit. This is green. This is what green is, everyone. It's not just renewables. As you heard earlier, it's transports, but it goes beyond that. It's also green buildings. It's also resilience investments. It's also the social investments that repair us. There's a wall of money out there. There is a wall of money out there wanting this stuff. If we can issue in the format, and we've seen this in the region with incredible success in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Indonesia, and in Malaysia with domestic investors, and in Singapore, we will see more of that money flow. The problem at this stage is not the demand of money, it's merely more people coming to market. And Anuj, I'm hoping you're going to solve that for us with your support at ADB. We've got 3 jobs to do. Make it easy for people to understand what qualifies. That's what F is talking about. That's the purpose of the taxonomy work. That's 1. 2 is we will, to get the flow of water happening, do some kickstarting. That's what preferencing is. That's what the work that ADB is doing, the Catalytic facility, is all about. But there are many other things we can do too. In Jakarta, for example, we could decide to give an extra few stories height for any building that's zero carbon, or in Manila for that matter. There's a bunch of things we can work on in this area. And then finally, it's just asset creation. It's making sure our planning laws, our government laws are in line with what we need to do to create a better society for our children, knowing the money's there to pay for it. So opportunity is incredible. Oh, I can go on a lot about opportunity, Anuj, but I'll stop there because Teaser's got a great story too.
Thanks very much, Sean. As always, that's such a well put through argument for the markets. And your central point, if there's a wall of money out there, if you can get the investments and the issuances right, I think that's the criticality with 60-70% financing gap every year in Southeast Asia. Every year that's building. We need that global pool of money. And your last point, which was on asset creation for a better life for our future generations. I think those things need to come together so well. And the bonds is sort of the market is almost like a regulator in terms of the use of money in that particular country. So it all meshes together, the policy with the global pool and sort of a view of what's happening in that country. So thanks very much for that, Sean. As ever, wonderful. Climate policy initiative. Let me turn to Teaser. And CPI was really at the forefront with its development of this idea for national green funds, green recovery funds. I myself am working on something based on one of the CPI models for Indonesia. But let me bring in Teaser and ask, what do you think now about national green funds? What role can they play at the national level, or can they to de-risk and create projects, or should it be at a subnational level? Can they take on some of the risks that COVID has created in terms of the revenue shortfalls? And should there be any policies needed at the government levels to drive such green funds and green finance? Over to you, Tisa, for your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anuj. The answer is yes, absolutely. Green recovery funds do have a potential to, de-risk, incentivize fund flows to green projects at a time when government fiscal capacity is contracting. I know Sean said that I would have a great story. I'm going to characterize my story today more as a cautionary tale, I think. So, I mean, we've done some research on the Southeast Asian region. We've CPI together with Ville Economics has analyzed 5 Asian countries, including Indonesia. The story that's coming out of it is that much more needs to be done. So, I mean, there are different levels of, incentivizing funds. In particularly if you are seeking to attract private finance, right? Firstly, there are policies that are that target broad, countrywide, sector-wide changes. And number 2, you also need to have policies that target specific project-level interventions. And green recovery funds can actually play a role in both of these. So at the macro kind of sectoral level, country-level policy signals are very important, especially if they are followed by public spending that matches that policy signal. So recovery funds, in this regard, is a strong policy signal. Virginia mentioned today how the sheer amount of recovery funds globally is astounding. 4.6 trillion United States dollars spent on recovery all over the planet. That is a big amount, and it's no surprise that people are scrutinizing those amounts, scrutinizing where exactly do those funds flow. So it's not only a potential source of green funds, but it is a strong policy signal that also tells a message to investors looking to invest in the country. What kind of things is the country prioritizing? So based on our research, the majority of recovery funds are not green. Only very few countries, for example, South Korea, Germany, UK, France, has allocated a significant portion of their green recovery funds to green initiatives, but the rest, not so much. Indonesia and some other countries in Southeast Asia have very minimum to zero proportion of greenness in recovery funds. And worse than that, a large proportion is dirty. So in Indonesia, 10% of funds goes to environmentally relevant sectors. So, the energy sector, agriculture, industry, and waste, relevant, but not necessarily green. So out of that environmentally relevant sector, only 4% goes to positive environmental impact, and 96% goes to business as usual, goes to dirty industry. So as you can see, this doesn't exactly provide a strong policy signal that Indonesia is using the opportunity presented by the COVID crisis to prioritize green investment, isn't using the opportunity presented by economic recession that's happening everywhere to pull back up by prioritizing green investment and to level off the competition between the green and the dirty industry. There are some good examples from that 4%. There's state capital injection to state-owned electricity company to invest in solar PV in remote areas. There are tax breaks for renewable energy. There's incentives for public transport, incentives for mangrove management, arguably green subsidies for biodiesel. But the problem is these do not exist based on an explicit mandate for part of that recovery fund to be green. Rather, it exists because the recovery fund is generic and flexible enough that it allows for some green projects to benefit. So that's probably why we don't see enough of it. So I actually see a lot of opportunities here for medium to long-term recovery. We might be able to explain away the situation by saying, well, in 2020, all the countries were focusing on short-term recovery. All the countries were focusing on rescue. So it may be understandable they weren't really focusing on, green projects. But 2021 onwards, this is the time to start doing that, if not already. And so let's look at what does the 4% look like? What does the minuscule amount of green look like in the recovery funds? And let's make that portion larger. I think there should be an opportunity to carve out a definitive portion of the recovery fund to green initiatives. There should be a more explicit mandate for part of it to be portioned to green initiatives, and there should be green conditionalities built in to funds that are still flowing to dirty industry. I'll stop there, and we can discuss more later, I think.
Wow, Teeza, that's it speaks right to the heart of it. 4% out of a particular fund which is for green does seem a little minuscule, as you put it, and having an explicit mandate for a recovery fund to be green, I think is your key message there, which I think is so critical, which obviously I totally agree with. I know the CPI's work on Climate Investor One and features such as that are so vital to try and guide these recovery funds to be green, but it's a bit scary, the story that that the funds are not necessarily green and indeed going towards polluting industries, and what can we do now, I think is the question. So your points extremely well made and speak to the heart of it. Let me go back to Virginie. Hopefully Virginie is still on. You made several points earlier, Virginie, about especially on subnationals and cities, and maybe I can ask you to come back in with your perspectives on where's the best bang for the buck in terms of policy development for green recovery financing. What should a government do in terms of prioritizing their policy? So I know you mentioned that we should perhaps move or expand away from, or expand beyond, I should say, energy and transport, maybe cities. So what should they do in terms of building their policy framework for green recovery financing? Over to you, Virginie.
Thank you very much, Anuj, and thank you very much to the panelists for the excellent remarks. I think all of them have highlighted some critical elements of what could drive the change and drive the transition. We need common definitions. We need regional cooperation, which was one of the points of FERO. It's so important to go beyond national borders and share good practices and examples. We need good projects, as Sean mentioned. This is, without any projects, we're not going to drive any shift in investments. And what Teeza said as well on the need to move away from this rescue plan spirit. I mean, it's essential. It was essential. We know the social consequences of the COVID crisis. So we can understand why governments really focus their efforts on rescuing current economies. But now that we are in 2021, we need to move away from them and go to the true recovery, investing in productive assets that are really shaping the transition and changing the direction of the society and of the investment. So those are all essential. I could also emphasize the need to put a price on carbon, to fix the policy frameworks. But the challenge, I mean, yes, it's true, but the challenge is that we don't have time. I mean, the opportunity is now, the money is now. I mean, there are a lot of discussions on what the impact of the debt is going to be on the possibility of governments moving forward. But I think in a couple of years, I'm not sure we'll still talk about wall of money. So basically, we have a couple of years to invest the money we have now in the right types of assets. So how can we do that? I don't have the magic wonder, and it really depends on different countries' abilities. But I think one really important thing for governments is, if they don't change the policy framework, at least changing the narrative. We tend to oppose the green transition with development and recovery. And it is absolutely wrong. We need to make a better case of infrastructure projects that are good for climate, but also good for inclusiveness, for growth, for jobs. And this first point can help get the political opinion on board, which they are not necessarily. And this is a key barrier for not increasing the momentum in some countries. The second thing that for me is essential is capacity. I mean, it was essential before, but it's even more essential today. In times of crisis, people tend to do what they know, what they've been doing for years. They do more, they do quicker, but they don't do different. They just do what they've been told to do for years. And here, this is where building capacity in governments, but also in other partners and stakeholders, in banks as well, is absolutely essential. I mean, we haven't really discussed the role of development finance institutions beyond providing funds. But there's also, if you look at the ADB, I would be curious to know, one of the key recommendations of the 2018 report was development banks should change their way of evaluating performance. This is not about disbursement. This is really about how the money is disbursed. So putting green indicators on what is really the impact of the money disbursed. This is what governments should do, private sector should do, finances should do, and development finance institutions should do. Just to last point, there was a question in the Q&A posted on really if we identified any capacities in governments. One of the biggest capacity gap is on planning. I mean, it's not easy to plan a future that is low carbon, that is resilient, that is inclusive, that is good for growth, that is improving connectivity and regional. It's quite daunting. And this is where I think institutions like ADB, like OECD can help to provide governments with tools and modeling tools, and help them figure out how they can do that, but also helping them breaking silos, bringing together different ministries. So often the capacity is in the Ministry of Environment or Sustainability, and they're not in the Ministries of Transport, the Ministries of Industries, the Ministries of Economy. So it's very important to create this pool of capacity that will really generate a change in mindset of the people who are making decisions. And the second capacity gap I want to highlight as well is, I mean, it was upstream planning, but it's also at the downstream level, it's on project evaluation. We're still very much evaluating projects the same way we've been evaluating them for 20, 30, 40 years with net present value and the financial returns. Yes, we're integrating some financial dimension, environmental dimensions, but it's often at the side. And we really need to help governments have tools to monetize the externalities. I know it's jargon, and we need to find a much better way to convince them that it has value, but it is really their natural value, the value of their natural capital that needs to be integrated in the project evaluation. So this is actually the spirit of the activities we're going to pursue in Southeast Asia moving forward on this building capacity, bringing the capacity of the different institutions to the people who really need to use them moving forward. So I leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginie. Very, very good points. I like the monetize the externalities, and I think that's so important. Where the valuation of natural capital, we need to find a system to do it easily. Even to talk about structuring a green bond for a subnational is complicated. To a lot of let's say lower capacity governments. But this is, I think, fundamental. And I also completely take your point in terms of check on the impact of the money, not the volume of the money disbursed. And I think that's fundamental. So thank you very much for your responses on that, to you and the entire panel. Actually, I think that allows us to quickly step into some of the questions that I see are coming through. Maybe I can request Naida, my colleague from ADB, to step in and tell us maybe the top 2 or 3 questions which we can then direct to the panel to respond to. Naida, please come in.
Thank you, Anuj. Thanks for that. So there have been a couple of questions coming in. I believe we have 160 people online watching this panel, so that's quite good. So I'll maybe just pick 1 or 2. I think Virginie already covered the one on capacity, so that's quite good. I think the main one I thought that was quite interesting was what specific interventions could we use to incentivize private sector participation in adaptation-focused projects, especially in ANR. It's pretty relevant for ADB, especially as we are planning a lot of agriculture, natural resources type of projects, and we keep facing this issue of how do we mobilize private investment. Another one that came in, which I think also was partly answered, but could be a good question as well, is sort of what is, if we had to pick, what is the one big bottleneck currently that we see is kind of standing in the way of quickly scaling up green investment and green recovery? And I think speakers touched on it a bit. So maybe we could start with those 2.
So rather than specifically directing it at someone, would anybody like to take the first one on specific interventions to, that could incentivize private sector participation in adaptation-focused projects? It sounds more of a sort of a policy thing. Should I request CPI, climate policy? Tisa, would you like to come in, or Virginie, perhaps?
Sure, I can come in, and then Virginie could add to it.
Lovely.
For adaptation projects, what we see is that most adaptation projects are heavily funded by the public sector. And there is still a huge lack of interest from the private sector to invest in adaptation projects. And there are a few reasons for this. Number one is that some of the adaptation projects tend to be small scale. The most vulnerable communities that are in need of adaptation funds are small communities, are impoverished communities with small scale, livelihoods, maybe fisheries. So it's hard to create a value proposition for small scale projects like this. And the second reason why there's such a lack of funding is because the impact of adaptation funds is less understood. So Virginie mentioned earlier, the impact of money spent is not the same as the value of money spent, right? What we need to better define, or what we need to be striving for, is getting the optimal value of money that's dispersed. So with mitigation projects, it's more or less understood what kind of emissions reductions value that we could obtain from every dollar spent on mitigation projects. But with adaptation projects, it's less understood. And that, creates these hampers. I think that that's the reason why public finance should prioritize adaptation projects at this point. If we look at climate finance, so for example, in Indonesia, the map of climate finance shows how private sector financing is actually pretty good at addressing, investments in renewable energy, investments in waste, water management, investments in sustainable agriculture. It's been quite well addressed by the market. It could still use a lot of support, but it's relatively well addressed. With the adaptation sector, not so much. There is opportunities for public sector interventions, for example, to cluster small-scale projects, wrap it in a bigger, large-scale portfolio, present it as a value proposition for private investment to invest in. That's something that's possible. Have specific infrastructure projects that are meant to create resilience and adaptation, and then call for green bonds for that specific project. That could be another intervention. These things need to be thought of, not as a side thought. It's usually like in planning, it's let's focus on mitigation and then a little bit of portion for the adaptation. It's always like the black sheep. But now more than ever, adaptation needs to be at the forefront and needs to be prioritized.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Tisa. Virginie, would you like to add to that? Because this seems to link into your point on monetize the externalities almost, doesn't it? Maybe create a model for, sort of a quasi revenue for projects in adaptation. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anush. No, just to quickly complement what Tisa was saying. I mean, I think it's important to make the distinction between investment that makes sense for the private sector economically, and most of them are in the mitigation side. And sometimes on adaptation, it's much harder to make the business case. So sometimes we have to accept that actually the private sector may play a less bigger role in adaptation than in mitigation. And this is the place for public finance. Having said that, there are already a lot of private sector investment in adaptation. When it relates directly to the operations of the private sector, the companies are doing the investment to adjust their productive capacities to changing climate conditions around them, such as, I don't know, increasing irrigation if you're an agriculture company, and increasing direct investment in irrigation. And those investments are not tagged as adaptation because they're part of the new business life of companies. I mean, climate adaptation is part of their new constraints, risk, and opportunities. So I think moving forward, how we can help this happening is first by helping the companies and businesses understand the risks of climate change. And this is by, yes, modeling and knowledge and providing maps of what's going to happen in the future with global warming and things like that. And the second thing that you mentioned, and that is important, is indeed, again, how can we recognize in our economies that a watershed brings value to the global economy? And this is really the payment for ecosystem services. How can we make sure that those ecosystem services are monetized and are integrated in our evaluations of projects, but also in the evaluation of the performance of countries? I mean, it's no other debate, but is GDP the right really benchmark to measure the recovery of countries? Is a broader question that would worth being raised. But so again, I think there are some innovative financing tools and instruments that can help bring the value of those ecosystems in project evaluation. And I just want to mention some work that the IISD is doing. They developed a tool called SAVI, the Sustainable Asset Valuation tool. And precisely this is what they're trying to bring on the table, is how we can integrate in financial evaluation environmental externalities, and I think they're going to work with the GCF actually, or the GEF, Green Environmental Facility, on doing that. And those innovations are actually really important to look in the future. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Virginie. Sean, did you want to add to that? You've got a quizzical smile on your face.
Look, I just want people to know, that in the broader green and sustainable universe, there are adaptation bonds. There is no difference in demand. People will invest if you can construct the use case. Now, they are typically SSAs, sovereigns and subnationals, I will admit. We've seen adaptation bonds from Cape Town, from the Dutch government, the central government, the debt management office, from Fiji even. So it's there. So the issue is more the definitions and what you can count. And that's where F's work on taxonomy and the ACMF's work is becomes so important to provide guidance to make it easier. There is, of course, yes, a whole complex job about looking at the returns on investment and cash flows, particularly around natural capital and adaptation. There's a job to be done, but tomorrow morning you could issue a green bond for adaptation and it would fly off. So do it at a national level. It's the first thing I want to say, and that applies to Sukuk, by the way, too, as we have seen Indonesia and Malaysia. Where it gets hard is when we're looking at, I'm going to call broader issues of adaptation, which is what we've learned from the pandemic. Resilience, frankly. It's the social, it's the economic, it's the health system resilience. ADB's been doing some important work on this and fleshing out what that agenda looks like. That is new territory, but that also will fly off the shelves if you package it up in a thematic bond. And we've seen that with some of the UN SDG bonds that have come off the market. We want to knit all this together because fundamentally it's about making our societies more resilient to survive the shocks of the 21st century that keep coming through. But I want to finish up on the other question that was asked, which is around how we tackle the bottlenecks. I'm going to say one of the bottlenecks is knowing what to do. Sorry, I've got to keep saying taxonomy, green definitions. Make it easy for people. Make it easy for people to understand what are the right adaptation investments. There are wrong ones. Make it easy to understand what are the right building investments, the right transport investments. Building a string of petrol stations is not a mitigation investments. But building electric vehicle plants or building metro or subways in Manila, they are mitigation investments, and the same thing in adaptation. We need to make it clear, need to have a common language, and investors need it. They need a link between the frameworks they've got and what's happening on the ground. 1, 2, that's selective support. Capital markets get started by public sectors making sure we are providing selective support. When the Koreans started their bond market, not a green one, the bond market in the 1990s, they provided guarantees for 5 years. A whole lot of corporates issued bonds. It worked. And now they have a vibrant and huge bond market. We need to supply the same thing to green, which is what ADB is looking at doing, but we can bring more players into that. And there are many kinds of support, discounted capital, guarantees, even what the Malaysian Securities Commission is doing, which is around promoting frameworks for green sukuk and social sukuk issuance with some incentives around the cost of getting the independent review. These are simple things we can do. We will need to move on to a really tough thing, which is aggregation. How do we actually get money to those small landholders? I understand that. It is a tough one. It's going to take us a little bit amount of time, but we do have a vehicle available. The prime aggregated society, they're banks. We need to be able to incentivize banks to provide targeted lending programs. We have some experience with this in places like Germany. We've already had some experience in some parts of ASEAN, but we've got to grow it up and link it to that concessional green capital. So we have concessional programs. But it is hard working with a loan officer in Surabaya about what kind of loan they're going to make. And that's the make it easy part. So that's the R&D work we have to do. And I think we can do this with the banks. Certainly Islamic banks in places like Indonesia are really keen to act with this. They're desperate to act with this. And I think some of F's banks in the Philippines would be very interested too if there's a program organized. So we can do it now, tomorrow morning, and there's further work to make it more available to more people.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you very much. That's fantastic. I think leans in and brings in all the different aspects, and it's good to know that if you have an adaptation bond today, it will fly off the shelves. I mean, that's good to know because let me bring F in because I think F has also got some perspectives on that. F, please come in. You're in this right now.
Thank you very much, Anuj. It's a very interesting discussion, but I'd like to point out, you were talking a while ago about subnational, and to my mind, in many instances, geographic adaptation work is very much a subnational local government concern, and the financial markets are not unfamiliar with municipal bonds. So funding this necessary infrastructure, climate adaptation infrastructure through municipal bonds, it is not is not it's not unheard of, right? It's something that would seem something that would seem obvious. I think the challenge is in Southeast Asia, we don't have a lot of experience with municipal bonds, and this is where I think something like the ACGF can come in and catalyze a market that does not exist in Southeast Asia, but is accepted world over. I mean, PIMCO invests in municipal bonds throughout the world, and I would argue, just to add to Sean's comments and Virginia's comments, that a local government that can demonstrate thinking, a comprehensive climate thinking, where they can put together a credible and financially supportable adaptation project, is in fact demonstrating the kind of thinking and governance and risk management that should attract a lower premium or a lower cost of capital for them. And this is what we've seen in green and social and sustainable bonds, and what we've heard from investors, that the signaling effect of issuing these kinds of bonds demonstrates to investors not only is the issuer aware of the climate challenge, but it's taking concrete, credible, measurable steps, demonstrating, in fact, good governance, not just climate governance or climate awareness, but just plain old-fashioned good governance. And that seems to be where you get the pricing benefit from demonstrating that you're a good borrower, because you've managed your risks well, and you've integrated, as Virginia was saying, you've integrated this externality into your planning and decision making. And the challenge is the capacity. So I'm going back to what Virginia was saying. There's a lack of capacity in Southeast Asia, but instruments like the ACGF, institutions like the ACGF can bridge that gap. And what we've seen in ASEAN is, once you have proof of concept, 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 projects in Vietnam, in Laos, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, then people understand how this product works and why it makes financial sense to invest in them. So if we could just get a few off the ground to demonstrate, in this concrete instance of local governments issuing adaptation bonds, and concretely demonstrating that it actually lowers the risk to the investors and therefore deserves investment, I think it's a market that is raring to take off, but just doesn't exist in Southeast Asia right now. And again, it's an opportunity to build back better. It doesn't exist. Let's create it, but let's make it a green local municipal bond market in Southeast Asia. And I think OECD with capacity building programs, the EU, and definitely a facility like ACGF that supports project development and provides the initial de-risking for investors. I think that's how we can start. We can start this potential snowball of investments going. So just again to support what everybody has already said.
No, that's. I think that this one question I think has brought all the speakers together to actually offer the perspectives, which is fantastic, because it kind of sort of allows me to to have a takeaway from this session almost. Naida, if it's okay with you, I think we're out of time for further questions and answers. So we can always respond to those by mail if that's okay. Is that okay, Naida? I think Naida is on the mute now. Okay, but okay, so I'll just take a decision there. So, I think this is a great point to stop, because I think the session time is over. But, as a takeaway, it almost sounds, we've got all the major issues that we identified in terms of the signaling, the need for governments to create funds which are green, not just recovery funds, and so many other issues. But it almost comes down to the one or two key things that you can actually do as a government, as a multilateral, to try and really accelerate green recovery is maybe focus on creating these de-risking or let's say guarantee sort of approaches.
Sounds good.
Like Sean mentioned or F mentioned, where there is
yeah, that sounds good, Anuj. Sorry, you may have dropped.
Okay, thanks, Naida. Where basically the governments and the multilaterals can come together to support these green instruments. Now, whether it's a muni bond or whether it's an adaptation bond, which is going to be pushed, I think that seems to be like one of the key focus areas that we can actually do together as governments and as multilaterals together. Sounds like that's where we can, I think, go forward. And certainly as ACGF and ADB to try and support the issuances of such instruments, of such guarantee products at governments, and then establishing the proof of concept, I think seems like the way to go forward to make some happen so that many more can follow from there after that. I think if that is sort of a quick summary of the discussions, at least at the Q&A session, I'll try and draw the session to a close now by thanking the wonderful speakers we've had today: Jean-Louis, Virginie, Sean, F, Tiza, my colleague Naida, who've tried to bring together this very, very critical issue in a very short time together, and I think in a very passionate manner. So thank you to everyone. Let's all keep working away with all the governments and all the capacities and all the instruments that are needed to try and establish this proof that green recovery is good for the economies, for the people, and for the environment, and demonstrate that together. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to my colleagues at ADB for organizing this session, to the EU Switch program, and to the OECD for jointly organizing the session. Thank you to everyone, and bye for now.